Some background information. I really love the summertime. I love hiking, being outdoors and hanging with friends while camping and such. So during the summer of 2005, I was already starting to plan a little overnight camping trip in a national forest a couple of towns away from where I live. It is also important to mention that I do these types of things solo, and that this was my first time going with that specific national forest. I guess I was ultimately unprepared with this trip because while getting there, I had realized that I forgot to bring a ground cover for my tent, since I didn't use a tent with the built-in ground cover at the time. I also forgot some other small things, however. I was already more than halfway to the national forest, so I said F it and kept going anyways, since it was just going to be an overnighter. Things got worse when there was also a lot of traffic on the highway, throwing me a couple of hours off schedule. On my way there, I kept on glancing at the sky and looking at the sunset. Crap, I thought. It was already getting dark out. After 20 minutes of driving from the exit, I got to the mountains and there was nothing but trees on either side of the road. So not having been there before, I thought that I was already in the park. There was a moment I pondered how strange it was that there were no signs at the entrance. But already behind schedule and needing to set up camp, the thought disappeared as quickly as it came from my mind. After around 20 more minutes of driving through pure forest, and the road turned to gravel, I thought to myself, this has to be some sort of camping area, right? Looking back, I should have turned around there. But I was exhausted and a little stubborn by that point, so it was still dead set on finding some spot to camp. I finally settled on parking near a clearing on a dirt path and set up camp there. When I got out of my truck, things seemed fairly normal. The only thing that seemed out of place at the time, that there was no other sound except for the crickets and the sound of me setting up camp. No wind, no frogs, owls, not even the howl of a wolf, just the crickets and myself. It was already getting late by that point. It was a little past 9, so I had dinner, sat around the campfire for a little bit, and then crashed in my tent. I awoke at 11:15. I thought I had woken up because my back was stiff and due to me sleeping on the bare ground, but my back seemed fine. I came to the conclusion that I had woken myself up randomly, and so I tried to go back to bed. Soon after closing my eyes again, I heard what sounded like a deep, raspy whirr not far in the distance. That was presumably what had woken me up initially. I sat up immediately. Now what in the hell was that? I murmured to myself, since this didn't seem like the howl or growl of any animals I knew about. I went back to my sleeping bag, desperately thinking to myself of a logical explanation as to what made that sound. Maybe it was an owl being killed by a wolf or something, was what I concluded. After around 2 minutes of trying to fall back asleep, I was immediately jolted straight awake by that same shrieking sound right next to the wall of my tent. Pure shock, I immediately jolted up, bust out the front of my tent and ran straight in the opposite direction of what I heard. I didn't look back, and I also was unable to catch a glimpse of what it was. I was running for a couple of seconds when I slipped down a hill and tumbled for a couple of seconds until I stopped. I tried to keep as still as possible. Maybe the thing didn't see me fall, I thought. I didn't want to give away where I was. I listened closely, but there was no sound. I waited a little longer, still nothing. I peeked over the hill, trying to see as much of my campsite as I could in the pitch darkness. I didn't see any of it. While doing this, I noticed how there were no crickets chirping anymore. Pure silence. I didn't hear any leaves crunching either. To me, it seemed to be all clear that I could make a beeline for my tent, grab my pack, which had some miscellaneous stuff in my wallet in it, but most importantly my keys, and hightail it out of there. I knew I had to make this quick, so I tried to get to my car as quickly as possible while making the least amount of sound. I eventually got my keys from my bag, at which point I went over to the car, unlocked it, and turned the car on. Once I did this, I started to floor it out of there. I knew I shouldn't have done what I was going to do next, but I took one last look back at the tent. Crouching down, right beside the tent was the thing. Even in the darkness, I could make out its features. Its eyes were completely black, its body was covered with short white hair, and the overall body structure was barely that of a human. I knew it saw me because I saw it. The creature let out a screech that I'm all too familiar with now. I punched the gas pedal on my car and didn't stop until I got to a hotel a good distance away from the neck of the forest. I must have looked like a backwoods insane person or something when I came into the lobby all dirty in my pajamas. But I still got a room and immediately collapsed into the bed, exhausted. I had a nightmare that night where I was looking at myself in the third person, sleeping in my motel room, and the creature appeared at my window slowly before letting out a horrific screech. I jolted awake to the sound of nothing but my own heavy breathing and the crickets outside. I might be paranoid, but I'm fairly certain that at one point, that night, I heard the same screeching again, off in the distance.
My fiance and I postponed our wedding in 1990. We were getting stressed and needed a vacation. We lived on the Big Island in Hawaii, so naturally, we went to the mainland. We did not have much money, so we rented a car, bought a tent, and decided to try to visit and camp in as many state/national parks in the western US as we could. We were driving in the middle of nowhere on our way to Yellowstone. It was a desert-like area we were driving through, and it was the end of September. It was very hot. We saw an old building far from the road and decided to take a break to explore it. As we approached the building, we could hear flies and the smell of something bad. We opened the door and it was like a big farm building. The walls and metal roof were splattered in blood. Everywhere we looked were body parts of elk. I am from the islands, but my fiance was from Northern California and familiar with wildlife. He said they were elk bodies. There must have been at least 50 or more of them in there. It was so strange. They looked like they were torn apart. Pieces of meat were flung and hung all over inside the building. I freaked out and started to cry. The smell and sights were overwhelming. My fiance said he couldn't understand it, because it was not like they were being processed or collected for anything. All the meat or horns or everything else were just in there, strewn apart. And he said it looked like they were torn apart, not cut with a knife. I had to go. I felt like I was in shock. My fiance refused to let me call the police. He said he did not want to get involved. He said it must be the work of crazy poachers. A few miles later, we entered Yellowstone National Park, where, as usual, we chose an out-of-the-way campsite. We were on high alert as we had been listening to a news story on the radio about a female hiker camping in a remote area of the park alone. Apparently, she was torn apart by a grizzly bear. There were few details about the attack, and I'm sure I'm unable to find any written reports of anywhere online. Because we heard the news report on the radio for several days before getting to the park, I find it odd that I can't find much on it. We had a campsite with a bathroom nearby and a barbecue. There were very few people in the park and no one camping near us. There were signs everywhere warning people that they should be careful with food stores because of the bears. We had a couple beers and went to sleep in the tent. I often got hungry after dinner and decided to take a bag of pears into the tent, thinking that if I put it under my pillow, that no animals could smell it there. Remember, I'm from Hawaii, and we do not have wild animals here. There are no bears, skunks, possum, squirrel, chipmunk, armadillo, wolverines, elk, lions, or snakes. We do have deer and boar in the mountains, but they were introduced by European hunters like 100 years ago or so. I fell asleep, pears snugly under my pillow. I was awakened by an immense weight on my upper right side of my chest. My entire right arm and right side of my torso felt like it was stuck. My first thought was bear. There's a bear on top of me wanting my pears. But as the seconds developed into minutes, and the minutes turned into hours, this immersive weight never once moved, nor did it shift, or twitch, or even make a single sound. In the first second, I decided not to move or make any noise, and definitely not awaken my boyfriend, who was soundly asleep to my left. I felt myself beginning to panic, thinking, that I had to be a bear attracted to my pears or something. But as time dragged on, I realized if this were a wild animal, it was literally on top of me, inches from the fruit. It would have pawed or done something to get inside the tent, or at least shifted, moved, or snorted or breathed as living things do. But to me, I felt like a car was parked on the upper right half of my body, the way it was so heavy and unmoving. What the weirdest aspects besides it being a massive, unmoving, totally silent something was that it was warm. This flurry of thoughts and confusion literally dragged on for hours. I became so terrified and overwhelmed. I knew whatever was sitting or standing or laying or parked on me could not have been of this world. Once, after all the hours of trying not to breathe heavily, panic, or even twitch a muscle, I passed out cold from sheer terror. My mind and body just shut down. I totally understand now, when people see a cryptid or a monster, why they faint or lose bowel control. The big difference with me was I could not see it, I could only feel it. And thinking it was a grizzly bear, that could cause its razor-sharp teeth and claws to easily get into the tent, which made it so more confusing. When I woke up the next day, my fiance was already up. I told him what happened, and I was completely freaked out. I checked the tent for any marks or signs of something on the fabric, but there was nothing. There was also no suspicious paw prints or footprints around the tent campsite. Instead of listening to my story, my fiancé stopped me at the part about the pears under the piddle and scolded me for quite a while. I was totally still freaked out and wanted to leave. My right arm and the right side of my body were aching. That was not a dream, nor was it sleep paralysis. I have never been that terrified in all of my life. Never before or since that have happened. I told this story to an experienced Sasquatch researcher, and he said these types of tent antics are pretty common with juvenile Sasquatch. He said many researchers and witnesses believe that Sasquatch can actually see through the tent fabric somehow and enjoy harassing campers. He calls campers with intense sack lunches. He described how campers tell of being in their zipped-up tent and then being picked up and carried several feet away. Other witnesses describe hearing their tent zip or unzip and a hairy hand reach in to touch them. I think what convinced me that this was a Sasquatch reclining on my tent was that what the research explained about Sasquatch abilities. They are able to remain unmoving, even without a twitch or spasm, for literally hours at a time. He pointed out how in nature, they use this ability to camouflage themselves so effectively.
At the time, I was 26 years old, and I loved traveling around Australia, camping in my van, usually by myself. And 99% of the time, these were all amazing experiences. On this particular trip, I was heading from Mount Kosciuszko in southern New South Wales, north towards the Blue Mountains. But I wanted to break up the drive for a night by camping in a state park, and maybe take a shot or two at some rabbits with my longbow. I found what I thought to be the perfect isolated state park where hunting was allowed, and since it was midweek, the weather wasn't amazing. I figured I'd have the mountains mostly to myself. I'd not taken into account the quality of the back roads to access the camping site. They were very badly maintained rock and dirt tracks that my tiny Toyota van struggled with. It took me over an hour to travel the 30 kilometers to the campsite, swearing to myself often as I rattled over yet another patch of corrugated dirt, with the rear end of my van spinning out behind me. I was feeling grim and tense when I finally pulled up into the site, but I relaxed pretty quickly as the site was empty of people, and I could see rabbits hopping around about 200 meters away in a meadow. As soon as I pulled up beside a designated fire pit, I strung my bow and headed after them. The little guys had obviously already been hunted a few times before though, as they were too skittish to get close enough for a confident shot. After some tries and fails, I let the rabbits go about their rabbit lives and headed back to the van, where I started a fire, poured a glass of whiskey and lit a cigarette. Enjoying being out here in solitude, and knowing that the closest population of people was over an hour's drive away. Now, I loved being by myself in the bush, but I've got this weird intuition thing. that lets me know when I've landed in a safe space or not. A couple of times in the past, I've driven into a potential site, and after a while I get this pressure in my chest and stomach, and when that happens, I bail, no questions asked. After sitting around my fire for a while, I did begin to feel this pressure slightly, but after another whiskey, I decided to ignore it this time. It was far too late in the evening to tackle that road, and I was over the legal driving limit by now, after that second whiskey. Truth be told, I was probably over the limit after my first glass, so I just sat there drinking, smoking, and watching the sun go down. The sun disappeared quickly, as I was in the bowl of a small valley with looming mountains all around me, and after watching the first stars appear, I decided to call it a night. I dropped 2 pairs of shoes outside my van door. One was a small pair of sandals, and the other was my massive hiking boots. I always do this when camping alone, because I hope any creepers might think there's a man in the van, a big one, and leave me alone. I fell asleep pretty quickly, but the sound of a gunshot around midnight woke me straight up. It sounded like it was on the other side of the mountain range to my left, so I largely ignored it. Maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought I was, and that there were hunters out there after deer or wild pig. I fell back to sleep pretty quickly, but I didn't sleep as well as I did before. I was awakened again by a much louder gunshot, and it was about an hour later. This one had definitely been fired somewhere inside my little bowl in the bush, and it was a larger caliber rifle. The echo was huge in this confined valley. I was beginning to feel nervous. What if they were taking shots, and my van happened to be in the way if they missed their target? I peeked through my curtains and saw my fire still had a few glowing embers. I hoped that the hunters might see it, and know not to shoot in my direction. That was my biggest concern at the time. I had no idea things were about to get much, much worse. For the next hour or so, I drifted in and out of sleep, snapping awake and aware of even the smallest noise. On one of these bouts of drifting in and out of consciousness, I heard a sound that had me sit straight up in bed. I hit my head on the roof of the van pretty hard by accident, but I did not even notice at that point, as I was concentrating so hard on the noise that had awoke me. Tires rolling and grinding on the rocky dirt track leading to my campsite. Now I'm sure there could have been a few reasonable explanations for a car taking this isolated dead-end road at 3 in the morning. I even tried to think of a few, but I failed because I was so nervous, and I just sat there in my bed, straining my ears to the utmost, trying to figure out what this car was doing. Suddenly, my van was filled with a shockingly bright light as the mystery car turned into the campsite and stared down my van. I waited for the headlights to swing away, but they didn't. I couldn't see the car. My van has curtains at every window, and like crazy, I was parting them to give whoever was out there a good look into the van and at me. I was already feeling pretty spooked, but my terror rose sky high as I realized the car was now slowly driving towards me. The lights got brighter, the rumble of the diesel engine got louder, and what sounded like the world's heaviest and biggest tires rumbled and popped at the rocks underneath them. By then, I was frozen in place, too terrified to move even a muscle, as the four-wheeled beast kept slowly moving forward until it was nose to nose with my tiny van. The headlights were so blinding, even through my curtains, that I had to turn back to face the other way, with my back towards the front of my van. Then, I almost wet myself. Whoever was driving that car started revving the engine over and over, harder and longer each time. It was the most aggressive sound I'd ever heard coming from a machine, and I honestly can't tell you how freaking scared I was. I didn't know it was possible to feel more terror than I was already feeling, but I found out quickly it is always possible to reach higher levels of fear, because that was when the doors opened. They had exited their car, and they were coming closer. I broke the trance of fear long enough to grab my 6-inch hunting knife from the shelf above my head. I gripped it with white knuckles as I listened to a pair of heavy footsteps start to walk slowly towards my van. The other person must have been standing just outside their car watching and waiting, as I didn't hear the second pair of footsteps. Maybe they were more stealthy and quiet. Who knows? All I know is that I was straining my ears, and I was focused solely on the slow, purposeful steps of the first stranger as they stopped beside the sliding door of my van, right where I had dumped my 2 pairs of shoes. My van was locked at every entry point, but 100 what-if scenarios were running at light speed through my head. Maybe I could dive into the driver's seat of the van and belt out of there. Fat chance, with them being parked right in front of me. Even if I did manage to drive around them, I still had 30 kilometers of rough bush road to navigate. Bush tracks that their far superior car could manage with ease. I'd be run down before I'd even gone 100 meters. I could string my bow and jump out to confront them, but then I'd never been that keen on suicide. So I thought I'd give that one a miss. I didn't even have a map of the area, so running like a scared rabbit into the bush wasn't even an option. Oh, the irony. So what I did was wait, frozen in my sitting position, still white-knuckling my knife, while person 1 finally moved away from the side door of my van back to the car. Their engine revved again and again, as if trying to scare me out, and I still sat there. I sat still for what felt like hours, but was most likely just a few minutes, as I vaguely heard voices under the rumble of the engine. I couldn't make out a word, but the voices sounded masculine, and eventually, they just got in their car and slowly rolled away. I know how anticlimactic that sounds, but honestly, I don't really care a whole bunch. At the time, I was filled with so much relief, I was almost high off of it. And at the same time, I was so exhausted from the adrenaline, I felt I could sleep a week straight. I didn't sleep, though. Thoughts of them just hiding around the corner of the road waiting for me to make a break for it were running through my head, as irrational as that may have sounded. I think the most confusing thing was having absolutely no idea what they wanted. They could have just been hunters, I heard, who maybe saw my fire and thought they'd come down to say hi, do a bit of light-hearted terrorizing. Or they could have had much darker things on their mind. Maybe they were locals who wanted to play a prank to relieve their small-town boredom. Anyone wants to shed some light on it, go for it. After 20 minutes of silence, I finally managed to pry my fingers off the handle of my knife, one by one, using my left hand to do it. I put my knife beside me on the bed and sat staring glassy-eyed at the curtain on my rear window, with my knees pulled to my chest until faint light filtered through the material, turning my interior from black to smoky morning gray. I peeked out at the pre-dawn day and saw no car, no other people, just more rabbits, who I now could not find the heart or motivation to hunt. I opened the sliding door and struggled outside, feeling like I was in a dream. I made a cup of the strongest coffee in the world and sipped it while staring distractedly at the footprints surrounding my van. Then I got into the driver's seat and drove an hour back to the main road. I kept expecting to see the car around each hidden bend, but really I would have no idea if I saw it or not. I never saw anything of the vehicle or men who terrorized me, so that was that. I drove up to the Blue Mountains and met up with some Belgian friends, and ended up sticking with them for the rest of the 6-week trip. But I never forgot the feeling of being that scared, that helpless, that alone. Rarely, if ever, do I choose to camp in an empty campsite now. Now I'd rather move on to another one, filled with people.
I am 29 years old and have been researching and investigating the paranormal since I had my first experience at the age of 9 in 1998. I'm an extremely realistic and logical person who is not easily excited over things like a bump in the night. I have seen and experienced some things in my life but most people have not. Some don't believe and some do believe, but that's okay because I'm not here to convince anyone of anything. I'm just here to share. My light in the sky experience happened a few years ago in 2014. I was living in New York and went to Jones Beach State Park one fall night with a friend of mine. It was a chilly night, so we didn't plan on staying out too long, but it was nice to be able to walk along the boardwalk without dealing with the crowds of people. We soon stopped at the covered picnic area and to sit down and chat. The night was clear enough to see the stars, which can sometimes be difficult with all the light pollution on Long Island. We lost track of time with our conversations, and as we got up to leave, I had to glance up at the sky. I love the stars, and I noticed something odd. A very bright light had appeared over the horizon that wasn't there a moment ago. My friend, seeing that I was staring off into space, looked up and thankfully saw it as well. Two initial thoughts crossed our minds. One, it was an airplane, or two, it was just another star. We watched it for a few solid minutes, but it never moved from where it sat, ruling out the possibility of it being an airplane. Side note, my boyfriend is an airplane pilot and I spend a lot of time watching airplanes. This definitely was not one. So a few moments go by when we notice a second light, just as bright as the first, appear seemingly out of nowhere. It manifested right below the first light and just hovered there. Naturally, we looked at one another perplexed. When we looked back up again, a third light was now appearing below the first two. I don't know how long we stood there looking at these lights, but we did verbally discuss all the possibilities that might explain what they were. We tried very hard to be realistic in debunking this phenomena. After a while, the lights shifted, taking a triangular pattern. Again, we stood mesmerized. They did not change positions again. After what felt like forever, we finally decided that we should leave as it was starting to get late. We started to walk away, assuming that when we looked back these lights would be gone. Interestingly enough though, they weren't. They stayed right up there in the sky in that triangular pattern for almost our entire walk back out to the car. Only when we reached the park exit did they disappear. We believe what we saw were UFOs, though I'm not 100% comfortable labeling it as alien per se. UFO does stand for Unidentified Flying Object, which is exactly what they were. It was just one of my many inexplicable experiences I've had thus far in life. I wish we had a definitive answer as to what we saw out there that night. This story starts with a group of my friends and myself going backpacking in Yellow River State Park. 6 of us were backpacking through the hills during late fall. So, there was a lot of dead sticks and leaves all around, yet not very many other backpackers until we came across a couple of guys heading the opposite way. As we came close to them, they stopped and told us that we shouldn't go down into the valley, as they were there for the last 2 nights. We asked why not, and they said that they heard people talking near their tent in the middle of the night, even though they were the only ones there. My friends and I shrugged it off, because we ourselves have drunkenly wandered around at night exploring and stargazing. We continued down into the valley and set up our tents. There was 2 of us in each tent. 3 of us brought firearms, just because we were kind of paranoid. We would rather have them and not need them instead of not having them and needing them due to previous experiences. We get all set up and break out our liquor and cards and play a few games in front of the fire before we decide to call it a night. One of our friends passed out in front of the fire and didn't wake up when we tried to move him, so we decided we would just let him make his own way to the tent when he was ready and ended up going to bed without him. All of a sudden, we are woken up in the middle of the night of a semi-drunk slumber to our friend screaming at the top of his lungs, high-pitched and everything. We jumped out of our tents to find out where from was yelling. Who the hell was that? We had no clue what he was talking about until we saw his face. Now, you know when your friend is the first person to pass out at a party, you doodle all over his face with Sharpie? Well, apparently, some stranger was doing the same thing with charred wood and ashes. The problem was that he had an upside-down cross on his forehead and a pentagram on his shirt. I'm not religious at all, but I was kind of freaked out. We ended up going back into the tents, but I don't think any of us got much sleep. Then, at about 3:30 a.m., we started to hear rustling in the woods around us. It seemed to be everywhere, though. Then, we heard a voice say, "Give him to us." Now, I was freaked out and loaded a round into my pistol, but my friend seemed to jump the gun. Yes, same chicker-happy friend, and fired a round from his .22 into the air, through his tent. I then hear people running away from what seemed to be all around us. Needless to say, at first light, we packed up and got the hell out of there. We contacted the county sheriff's office and told them what happened, but they simply told us that there really wasn't much we could do besides report it.
This happened to me a year ago on a camping trip with my dad in late July or early August. It was a weekend trip and we were the only ones at the campground. For privacy purposes, I will not state the name of the park we were camping at, but I will say that it was in the state of Indiana. Anyway, I was awoken with a start one night in my tent. Checking the time on my phone, it was around 3:30 a.m. I was hesitant at first to get out of the tent, but my bladder was screaming, which forced me to get out of the tent. The sounds of the forest I would have had any other time found comforting, but this time, for whatever reason, they seemed to unnerve me. About 50 yards away, and uphill, was a porta potty, and since I'm a girl, I can't just pee in the woods, so I grabbed the headlamp which my mom had loaned me, turned it on, and headed to the porta potty. I was talking to myself in an attempt to calm my nerves, mostly because I was complaining about my bladder, and how dim the headlamp was. The light was so faint that it only illuminated 5 feet in front of me, so I ended up relying on the light of the moon to guide me. I made it to the porta potty without incident, relieved my bladder, and then headed back to the tent. Once I was around halfway there, it struck me. The forest was now silent. Eerily silent. My mind began imagining the horrors of what was lurking in the woods. Skinwalkers, Wendigos, Bigfoot, who were just waiting for me to get in range so they could snatch me up and make me their dinner. With the speed of an Olympic runner, I sprinted the last 20 yards back to camp faster than anyone's ever seen. The headlamps died almost as I got there. Upon arriving at camp and catching my breath, I got the sensation I was being watched. I turned to face the tree line that bordered the lake and saw a pair of large yellow golden eyes. My tent is very close to this tree line, so whatever this thing was less than 15 feet away. Frozen in fear, I stared back at the eyes, then my headlamp went out. But the eyes of this creature were still glowing. I am a rational person, so I first figured it was a coyote or a large stray dog, and my headlamp's light was just reflecting off the eyes, giving the illusion that they were glowing. So when my headlamp went out, I expected the eyes to do the same. However, they did not. They were indeed glowing a golden yellow. Terrified, I took a few steps back and lost my balance, falling onto my butt. The eyes got closer, and the moonlight shone on this monstrosity of a creature, revealing a silhouette that in no way matched the size of a coyote or a dog. It was far larger and appeared to be on its hind legs. If I had to guess, the creature stood taller than 6 feet and had a hunched over body. It had the head of a dog. If I had to guess, it looked like the head shape of a husky or wolf dog. Now, I know most people, when they talk about encountering dogmen, they mention a strong feeling of malevolence coming from the creature. For some reason, I think I felt the opposite. The eyes of the creature did not seem to hold any sort of malice or seemingly intent to harm me. Rather, I got the sense it was curious, or at the very least confused. After engaging in a staring contest with this creature, which probably lasted just about a minute, but felt like forever, the creature got back to all fours and retreated into the forest. But it made no sound as it did so. Was it Dogman or a werewolf or whatever you want to call it? I don't know. I know it wasn't a bear. We don't have grizzlies in Indiana, and black bears aren't all that common. I'm honestly at a loss as to what this creature was. It left no tracks behind in the muddy banks of the lake. If any of you know what it could be, please comment down below letting me know.
Last Thursday night, me and my fiance were driving around looking for something to do around 11 p.m. Our friend Sierra called us and asked if we wanted to meet her and her new boyfriend at a diner in town. We got there, had some pies, and decided we should do something. None of us had to work Friday, so we were going to hit the bars. Me and my fiance went to grab another friend of ours who wanted to come. After we got him, we all met back up at the 7-Eleven. It turned out that all the bars were empty, so we were brainstorming what to do instead. That's when Sierra suggested we go to the cemetery. We live in a city at the end of the Oregon Trail. In what used to be the outskirts of the city was a little state park. The park is located on top of a large cliff. Also, about a mile from the parking lot is a cemetery you can only go to by walking. The cemetery used to be an Indian graveyard, but over time, they would put people who lived in the city in the graveyard too. Also, settlers used to chase off Indians off this cliff in droves, and many of the people of Indian descent have committed suicide by jumping off this cliff. Honestly, the whole place is just creepy and has this vibe, even during the day. Anyway, my fiance was really against it, but the group talked him into just going to the park. We get there around 1 a.m., and we are standing at the top of the cliff which overlooks the city. Everything is okay for a while, but then my fiance quiets everyone down, and I swear to God we both heard footsteps to our left. Our whole group was to our right. We freaked out and made the whole group leave. As we were leaving, I looked at my fiance and something to our left caught my eye. It was a bright ball. It came up from the top of the trees, made an arc and came back down. It wasn't like transparent like a flashlight. It was a solid, like if the moon were really off in the distance, but still really bright and white. I even thought it was the moon for a second, but then I looked up and saw the moon big and full, and a red from smoke from fires all over the state. Later in the car, I asked my fiance and our friend that we picked up earlier if they'd seen it too. They had, so I wasn't going crazy for a second. There was actually something there. As we got to the car, my fiance looked behind us and swears he saw another white orb in the forest. But it couldn't have been a lamp or something because we were at the edge of the city and there weren't houses for miles. Also, there were no other cars in the parking lot, so it couldn't have been another person. Anyway, we drove out there as fast as we could. We dropped off our friend, and he had me drive his car because he was too freaked out. By the time I drove myself home, he seemed fine. Looking back, I really wish I spent the night with him. The night after he dropped me off, everything was fine for a while. But once he started driving around the back roads near his house, weird things began to happen again. He was listening to some music on Pandora while driving. Well, mid-song the track somehow skipped from Tiny Dancer to Dance with the Devil. Then, something black ran in front of him. He slammed on the brakes so not to hit it. He looked behind in the mirror to make sure there wasn't someone driving behind. That's when he saw a pair of eyes and dark outline of a person in his back seat. Then the song changed back to Tiny Dancer and the figure was gone. He parked the car in his driveway and ran inside on full panic. Nothing else happened that night, but he was a bag of nerves for days. The following story involves a group of my friends and I backpacking in Yellow River State Park. 6 of us were backpacking in the late fall when not many people were around when we came across a couple of guys heading in the opposite direction. They informed us we shouldn't go into the valley as they spent the last couple of nights there and could hear people talking outside their tent at night, despite no one else being around. My friends and I laughed it off as we'd drunkenly been stargazing in the past. I didn't think much of the story. We eventually reached the valley and set up our tents. There were 2 of us per tent, and 3 of us had firearms on us. After setting up, we broke out the liquor and cars to play some games before calling it a night. By the end of the card games, one of our friends had passed out near the fire, and we decided that we'd leave him there putting the fire out, as they weren't getting out. Later that night, we were awoken to the sound of our friend screaming. Who the hell was that? Having no clue what he was on about, we all looked at him and realized someone had drawn on his face with ash from the fire. They'd drawn an upside-down cross on his forehead and a pentagram on his shirt. I'm not religious by any means, but I was pretty freaked out by this, that some random person came out of the woods and did that. They don't freak out anybody, really. After returning to our tents, unable to sleep, we heard rustling in the woods around us. I believe it was about 3:30 in the morning when this happened. It was at this point we heard someone yelling, "Give him to us. Give him to us. Give him to us." I freaked out and loaded a pistol, but my friend fired a round from his .22 into the air immediately. The sounds of people running away surrounded us all from all sides. The moment we had light, we left and also reported what happened to sheriffs, but they said they can do nothing but take a report. A lot of help they were. Be careful out in Yellow River State Bar.
This story took place in a state park in Tennessee on my 12th birthday. We were having my birthday party out there. That year I got a load of gifts, including something I thought was awesome. A wireless keyboard that had batteries and a wall hookup so we could play it on the go if you wanted to. That being the case, I quickly asked my mom if I could play it, and she said yes. I headed out into the woods away to be by myself, so that the noise of the party didn't distract or overtake the music. It was beginning to get dark, but I was so excited that I thought I'd get back in no time. I found a huge, and I mean huge, tree, and I sat down next to it. I began to play some keyboard music. Before attempting to play Heartache from Undertale, since it was one of my favorite songs, I was having fun until I began to hear something. It was like a scream, but not from a person. It was one of the most horrifying things I'd ever heard in my young life. I wanted to scream back, but as the sound seemed distant, I forced myself to keep playing. But then I heard it again, and once again, before I had had enough. I picked up my keyboard, and I walked away. Halfway back to the party, I suddenly heard a weird whistle. The thing was mimicking one of the songs I'd played. I began to walk faster. You might be wondering why I didn't just book it all the way. It's because I heard that running suddenly could exacerbate the creature's anger, make it want to pounce, really. I tried my best to keep calm and walked back, listening to the thing whistle at me. It was surprisingly melodic and accurate. I saw Mom and everyone else at the site, and soon I couldn't stop myself from running. I grabbed onto her tightly, and soon we packed up and headed home. But I swear to God, when we pulled away from the state park, I saw a tall figure with long legs, a triangular head, and short, dull antlers, and I couldn't help but think that that was the thing that had heard me playing my keyboard and that was coming towards the music.